Welcome to this episode of Digitally, digital ethics and privacy. They're topics that are top of mind for all of us in the companies that we serve and the communities we live in. But collectively, we're really not there yet. And some of this, of course, is our starting point. Some of it is the nature of the beast, but some of it is the stuff that's coming around the corner. It's just such high speed. Also, I've been at a lunch recently here in Seattle discussing digital privacy with a group. And I remember someone in the group turning to one of our colleagues and saying, "Hey, Bob, what you just said is very US centric." And I thought about that a little bit. And I think part of it also what's going on is that regulations, cultural norms, and indeed awareness levels are also so different across the world. And so I thought this is a topic worth spending some time on, and to bring in that someone who's an expert in the field. So let me introduce Aaron Weller. Aaron's an expert, he's an operator, he's an advisor in the field of privacy. And with him together, we will unveil privacy.
Thanks, Sanjay. Happy to be here.
So Aaron, I thought the first place to start really is you've had an incredible career, but I reflect back and I think about when you started, you couldn't have possibly gone to school thinking you're going to be in privacy. And so how did that even come out to be?
Yeah, my undergrad's actually in physics, so very, very different. I actually had a career, most of my career was in information security, and I moved to a new role that I inherited a privacy class action lawsuit. And I realized I needed to get smart really fast about privacy. So I realized that it was a very interesting field, and at the time, very immature, probably about 10 or 15 years ago. So that was when I kind of made the transition, and now I do privacy full time.
And based on the comment you made around US-centric views, at least in this one small conversation, but just even judging by your accent, and I know you a little bit, so just tell us a little bit of your background as well and where you started, and obviously now you're in Seattle, but what's the journey that got you here?
Yeah, absolutely. I started my career in London, worked in financial services for a number of years, ended up moving out to Australia, lived 2 blocks from the beach, which was very different from London, and then wanted to work in Silicon Valley. So I moved to Silicon Valley, lived in California, and then ended up migrating north like a lot of us did to Seattle.
Yeah, that's right. I did as well. Okay, so let's then now just jump in and we'll get started with privacy. And the first thing I guess that's top of mind for all of my audience here is, help us get our arms around that problem. Why is it such a big deal? What's the size and scope of what we're talking about? And what are the risks of not doing it right?
So a lot of the challenges we have at the moment are that everyone says they want to be ethical and do the right thing with data. But there's a lot of examples where people don't follow through. It's similar to New Year's resolutions. Everyone says they want to go to the gym, they want to work hard. But a lot of that time, the benefit is in the distance. Right, whereas the instant gratification that we usually want, and when we're thinking about how we use information, that's often the same way, right? We need to make decisions now, and we're not really thinking about the longer term implications. So sometimes there is that gap between what we think we should do and what we actually end up doing, and that can lead to some of those risks that you were talking about.
And I imagine you've seen a bunch of stuff in your career around some of these risks, but just give us a sense for when things go wrong. What could it look like?
So some of the challenges, a lot of this isn't black and white. And that technology moves very fast. Legal frameworks don't tend to move so fast. So we've got a lot of gray areas where there are things that aren't strictly illegal, but they're things that maybe could be unethical or they could damage the trust in your organization. But the law is catching up. So there was a law that was just passed this week when we're recording this in Connecticut, where one of the things in the law is that they say you can't use any design elements that mislead someone into doing something that maybe is not in their best interests. Very, very vague, right? So now we've got to think about whenever we design UIs or we think about how are we actually communicating what we're doing with people's data, we've got to look for those kind of things that could then be enforced against us. So it's the law is changing, but it's still not it's not checklist based like some of the other domains we work in.
So is that the recommended approach, which is figure out what the law is and then follow it closely? Or is this a scenario where you sort of saying, Sanjay, think ahead because the law isn't 100% where it needs to be and things are evolving? I mean, give us a sense. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very immature field still. So privacy really is, if you compare it with information security, probably at least 10 years behind from a maturity space. So a lot of these things, there aren't clear answers, which was one of the things that actually attracted me to privacy in the first place. You get to kind of work on problems that people don't have clear answers to. But yeah, following the law should be a baseline, but increasingly we're seeing other drivers like privacy being included in ESG, so environmental, social, or government reports as well. So really thinking about how this broader kind of view of how do we use data, because that's now so important to so many organizations, like every company is a data company. But really we're now driving towards not just the legal compliance, but also the loss of trust, right? So trust you can look at as a series of kept promises, right? If I keep promising things to you and I don't deliver, it's going to damage the trust in our relationship. But that's kind of the thing that people are driving towards. The more sophisticated companies don't just look to the law, but they look to some of these other drivers as well to help work out what the right thing is to do.
Okay, so I think you've set this up really well. I want to come to what do we do about it. But in a nutshell, I think what I heard from you is data is every company is a data company. Data is the new oil. Following the rules is a foundation and a baseline, but isn't always enough. And social and ESG components are increasingly other components are coming into play as we think about privacy. And so against that big backdrop, right? I come into a role where this becomes important to the company. Where do I start? What's my first step? What is my second step? How do I go about this? Can you lay out a framework that I can use?
Absolutely.
Our audience can use.
Yeah, so I think for a couple of things that are real easy is, number one, it's making a formal commitment, right? You have to actually say, this is what we're going to do. And part of that communication is then showing that you are really, that's something that is important to you and something that when you've communicated it to somebody else, they can then hold you against that commitment as well. So I think understanding, how are you going to make that commitment, that then you're going to build the steps to follow through. I would say that when you're looking at privacy, we talk about building a culture of privacy in the organization. So thinking much more broadly than the legal compliance we talked about. How do we think about, what are the downsides? How are we going to have an impact on people from the choices that we make? There's a lot of examples, even this week in the press, around where data's been shared and then there's these downsides that are being applied to groups of people. Sometimes those things aren't really considered, but build that into the process when you're thinking about new data uses, so that you can say, what could go wrong? That the grandmother test, right? And what if my grandmother saw that I was doing this thing? Would she think good of me or bad? So really bringing that, some of those things that I said were gray areas, and try and make them part of the formal way that you develop things.
So call it out, which is an important step, because you have to define what your policy and your posture is. I think you talked about build a culture around it, because you're not going to be able to cover every single edge case in a rule book somewhere. So you need people to be aware and be able to think through. So you need a culture really, which is really a long-term mechanism. And then have a process so that you treat it as a formalized mechanism as opposed to a one-off, right?
Exactly. Yeah, build it in rather than bolt it on at the end, for sure.
So for those of us that really want to take that advice to heart, you give us a sense for what's the North Star look like? What does good look like? What does bad look like? And how do we make the transition? How do we get there?
I think there's enough articles in the headlines around what bad looks like. We probably see those every day. There's a framework that I like actually out of the University of Santa Clara that talks about how do we make ethical decisions. One of the hardest things I think is not just to think about the impact on individuals within a data set or a use case you're looking at, but increasingly we have such impact on society as a whole. You can even look at some of the examples like one of the cold cases from the 1980s was just solved by comparing DNA and finding relatives. That was never the intent of that information being shared in the first place. So now we've got these broader impacts beyond those organizations. I don't think those things have ever really been formally considered because we didn't have the impact that we have today. So some of those things, it's, as I said, still an emerging space, but really thinking about having a structured approach that, importantly, that people can raise these concerns if they do see things that could be seen as being unethical or against kind of the organization's values. How do they raise those in a way that they'll be taken seriously? Because we've often seen that a lot of the things that end up in the press, there's a single whistleblower who felt that they had to go public really that's something you want to avoid. So having those processes internally that people could raise those areas, and then you can deal with it and kind of manage that internally would be, a great tip to be a good organization around these things.
Actually, that's a fantastic insight. I mean, well, now that you say that, it's obvious, but I don't know that I would have thought about it originally. So I think that's a great learning, and I appreciate you sharing that. Well, listen, I mean, I think that I've always had this view, and as we work with boards and the CXOs at large corporations, my view is that most boards eventually will end up having an ethics subcommittee, no different than an audit or a compensation committee. It's just going to be the way we do things. And this is a topic that is super important to all of us, both in the communities we live, in the companies we serve, and the world we operate in. You're linked into this discussion. And so hopefully you'll be okay if we have more questions and there's a follow-up discussion on this. We'll look to pull your insights in there. And Aaron, before I thank you and close this event, is there anything else you'd like to mention and things that you want to leave behind with our audience as they think and course their journey through privacy?
I think the leave behind is that privacy is everyone's issue. There's probably not a single group in the organization that doesn't touch personal information in some way. So really, it does take a village. It takes a community of people. You can't rely on lawyers to solve all of the privacy issues. And I think that the getting that cross-disciplinary, people with maybe physics degrees or they've come from different backgrounds. To me, that always leads to the best answers, is when you bring people together.
I love that. And it's so true. Aaron, thank you for joining us. Grateful for your time and your expertise and advice. And please stay tuned into the LinkedIn channel. I want to thank my audience for joining us today. And I look forward to seeing you again on another episode. Thanks. Good day.
Thank you.